the Israeli Air Forces carried out a strike that eliminated Ibrahim Akil, one of Hezbollah's most senior military commanders and member of their Jihad Council. Since 2004, he has served as the head of Hezbollah's operations unit, in which he was responsible for Hezbollah's bombing attacks, anti-tank missile attacks, air defense, and other military fields. Akil was one of the most wanted men on the planet, with a $7 million reward on his head for the 1983 bombing of the US Embassy in Beirut and other terror attacks. He was responsible for the murder of hundreds of Americans, and Israel served him the justice he so richly deserved. On October 8th, while Israeli civilians were still being slaughtered in the south by Hamas, Hezbollah unleashed hundreds of rockets at our civilians in the north. Since that day, Hezbollah has launched over 8,000 rockets at our civilians. They have forced over 60,000 people to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. You can look at this image, which shows Hezbollah's Radwan force scouting our communities. I refer you to Resolution 1701, that they should not be next to our border. And look, you can see the Radwan actually on the fence with Israel, planning a similar attack like we had coming from Gaza on October 7th. Their sole purpose is to carry out a similar attack against Israeli civilians in the north. If Hezbollah is not pushed back from our border to north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens and enable the evacuees of the north to return to their homes. Thank you.
Ambassador, it's Pamela Falk from U.S. News and World Report. Do you see any possibilities during UNGA for backroom, back-channel talks or any kind of talks on Lebanon? And what's next in Lebanon? Thank you.
Well, I hope so. Today, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Lebanon will join us in the Security Council, and I hope he will speak about Hezbollah. And I call the parties to act now before it's too late, because we don't want to see escalation in the region. We have no intention to enter a war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but we cannot continue the way it is. So I will call them to be involved and try to find a diplomatic solution that will bring us to a situation where we enforce Resolution 1701.
Ambassador, this is Xu with China Central Television. There are a lot of speculations on, the communication device explosions. Can you confirm whether Israel is behind this or not?
So we are not commenting on the specific attacks you mentioned, but I can tell you that we will do everything we can to target those terrorists, to minimize casualties to civilians, but we prefer the diplomatic way.
Is there any update on the possible meeting between Mr. Antonio Guterres and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
So, because of the situation, we don't know what will be the schedule of the Prime Minister. He will not arrive on Tuesday like he's scheduled. It's postponed now, and we will follow what's happening in Israel. We will know when he's coming and if he's coming.
Ambassador Stefano Vaccara, Lavoci, New York, Ital Press. There is something that you expect that UNIFIL do that didn't do yet. I mean, what is your opinion about how the UN mission did so far in this crisis?
So we think UNIFIL should do more. They will not fight Hezbollah. Let's be realistic about it. But we expect them to report the violations of Resolution 1701, especially when they can see Hezbollah terrorists next to UNIFIL bases. And I have shown the Security Council previously that Hezbollah is putting the rocket launchers next to UNIFIL bases. So we expect UNIFIL, if they cannot push them, at least report what they are seeing.
Ambassador, yes, in Al News, Israel always talk about the civilians and how they protect themselves. And we restrict all the civilians around the world. But what about the
We are a peaceful nation. We didn't start this war. It was forced upon us. I think the blame is on the shoulder of Hamas. They are the one who actually attacked Israel. They are the one who are keeping, as we speak, 101 hostages, including babies and women, so they can end this war. They can release the hostages, and we can have a ceasefire. So I think the blame is not on us. We regret the loss of life of any civilian. But when you fight a terrorist organization who is hiding behind civilians, it is a problem.
Mr. Ambassador, I don't have a question. I have to say, my name is Samar Nader from Lebanon. Congratulations for today for killing Israel, and congratulations for killing 5 kids added to the 10,000 kids of Gaza. Thank you.
I will send you a message to the people of Lebanon. The people of Lebanon should speak up today against Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is hijacking the people of Lebanon, dragging them into escalation. And I think, even though it's hard for you maybe to say it here, what you really think about Hezbollah. I know it's hard for many Lebanese, but I call them to speak up and try to do whatever they can to avoid the escalation. Please.
Ambassador, just for France's report, if we had a situation where personal communications devices were booby-trapped in Israel and civilians were killed due to that, would you classify that as a war crime?
Well, when you look at the intention of whom we target, you realize that we target terrorists, period. And when you target terrorists, according to international law, you can target terrorists, even if they are hiding behind civilians. We do whatever we can to minimize casualties, and we use, without referring to what you said, we do use sophisticated weapons in order to target the terrorists and not the civilians around them. One more question, please.
Maria Ramadi with the Iran International News Channel. The Iranian ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran, Amir Saeed Iravani, said that they would follow up on the attack on the ambassador in Lebanon and also ask the Security Council and the Secretary General to take action against the attacks in their say Israel. What's your reaction to this statement from the representative of the
Well, I'm looking forward to hear him speaking at the council within an hour or so, and I would be very happy to hear him saying what I'm saying now, that we want to prevent escalation in Lebanon. I don't think the Iranians really care about what's happening in Lebanon. I think they are using the Lebanese people. They are using Lebanon as a launching pad against Israel, and I think the Lebanese people should stand up against that. Thank you very much.
Wrong way. It's not going.
The 9,730th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Abdallah Bouhabib, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Mr. Volker Türk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the situation in Lebanon and the region, including the most recent alarming developments. For nearly a year, Hezbollah and other non-state armed groups in Lebanon and the Israel Defense Forces have exchanged fire across the blue line on an almost daily basis. These exchanges have been in repeated breach of the cessation of hostilities and in violation of Resolution 1701. Strikes and exchanges of fire have expanded in scope and intensity, and in some cases reached much deeper into Lebanese and Israeli territory. Over 100,000 people have been displaced from southern Lebanon. At least 60,000 have been displaced from northern Israel. The exchanges of fire have caused numerous casualties, including among civilians, and significant damage to homes, civilian infrastructure, and agricultural land on both sides of the Blue Line. The risk of further expansion of this cycle of violence is extremely serious and poses a grave threat to the stability of Lebanon, Israel, and the whole region. Mr. President, on the afternoon of 17 September, many communication devices, or pagers, primarily used by members of Hezbollah, exploded simultaneously across Lebanon. Similar explosions were also reported in Syria. The following day, a second wave of explosions, smaller in scale but more lethal, was reported throughout the same areas of Lebanon. This time, the devices involved were two-way handheld radios reportedly used by Hezbollah. Devices exploded in homes, cars, supermarkets, and streets. Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health stated that 37 people were killed, including 2 children, and more than 3,400 people were injured in the successive explosions. Medical professionals and hospitals are working around the clock to help the wounded. Lebanese society, old and young, have been in profound shock and panic. The Lebanese government has strongly denounced the attack, which it attributed to Israel. Caretaker Prime Minister Mikati said, and I quote, "It represented a serious violation of Lebanese sovereignty and a crime," end quote. In a speech on 19 September, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said in response to the attacks that Israel exceeded all limits, laws, and red lines. And he vowed, and I quote, "to exact a heavy price and a fair punishment," end quote. He reiterated that the Lebanon front would only stop once the aggression on Gaza ended. In a letter to the President of the Security Council on 18 September, the Islamic Republic of Iran blamed Israel for the explosions. Noting that its ambassador to Lebanon was among those wounded, Iran stated that it, and I quote again, reserves its right under international law to take required measures deemed necessary to respond to such a heinous crime and violation, end quote. To date, the government of Israel has made no official comment on these developments. Mr. President, since the explosions on 17 and 18 September, exchanges of fire across the Blue Line have continued, showing worrying signs of escalation. The exchanges include some of the heaviest bombardment of southern Lebanon since 8 October 2023. Israeli aircraft have conducted a high number of airstrikes and overflights, including breaking the sound barrier over Beirut on several occasions. In addition, we are receiving initial reports about an Israeli airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut hours ago, which Israel said targeted and killed a number of senior Hezbollah leaders. The Lebanese Health Ministry said at least 12 people were killed and over 60 injured in the strike. Meanwhile, heavy barrages of rocket, drone, artillery, and anti-tank missile fire from Lebanon have killed 2 IDF soldiers and wounded 10 Israelis. UNIFIL is monitoring the situation closely. On 16 September, Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, suggested that the center of gravity was moving north, including the transfer of military forces. Speaking of the onset of a, quote, new phase of war, end quote, he suggested the only way left to ensure the return of Israel's northern communities to their homes was through military action. Reports from Israeli media indicate that Israel Defense Forces 98th Division was transferred from Gaza to the Northern Command, adding to concerns about the risk of further escalation on the horizon. From Lebanon, UN Special Coordinator Hennes Plechard has been in constant contact with all concerned actors, including caretaker Prime Minister Mikati, Foreign Minister Mr. Bouhabib, Speaker of Parliament Nabi Berri, and their offices and other authorities. In her meetings, she has continued to push for a diplomatic solution and warned against further escalation. She continues to underscore that military advances would not restore stability or enable displaced civilians on both sides of the Blue Line to return home safely. She will travel to Israel early next week for consultations with relevant counterparts. Mr. President, in the current fragile regional context, the devastating war in Gaza continues. Nearly a year after the horrific atrocities committed by Hamas on 7 October, Israeli military operations, including bombardment from the air and land and armed exchanges with Hamas and other militants, continue across the Strip. The number of fatalities tragically keeps increasing. More than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, many of them children. At the same time, the indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other armed groups toward population centers in Israel also continues. I once again echo the words of the Secretary General. We need an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza. The risk to security and stability, not only in Lebanon, but also in the region, could not be clearer or graver. The Secretary General has already expressed his deep alarm over these events. I echo his sentiments and strongly urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint to avert any further escalation. They must abide by their obligations under international law concerning the protection of civilians. I also strongly urge member states with influence over the parties to leverage it now. as we approach a full year of near-daily exchanges of fire across the Blue Line and bloodshed in Gaza. Too many lives have been lost, too many people have been displaced, and too many livelihoods have been destroyed. But if things continue as they are, we risk seeing a conflagration that could dwarf even the devastation and suffering witnessed so far. It's not too late to avoid such folly. There is still room for diplomacy, which must be used without delay. The Secretary General continues to urgently call on the parties to recommit to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and immediately return to a cessation of hostilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies. I'm appalled by the breadth and impact of the attacks on 17 and 18 September in Lebanon on civilians, where the explosion of pagers, two-way radios, and other electronic devices have reportedly killed at least 37 people, including 2 children, and injured more than 3,400 people in Lebanon alone, leaving many with permanent disabilities and healthcare facilities struggling to cope with the magnitude of the impact on people. These attacks represent a new development in warfare, where communication tools become weapons, simultaneously exploding across marketplaces, on street corners, and in homes as daily life unfolds. Authorities have reportedly dismantled unexploded devices in universities, banks, and hospitals. This has unleashed widespread fear, panic, and horror among people in Lebanon, already suffering in an increasingly volatile situation since October 2023 and crumbling under a severe and long-standing economic crisis. This cannot be the new normal. Mr. President, war has rules for each and every party to this and any other armed conflict. Armed force, that is, violence against other human beings, can only be used where necessary to achieve a valid military objective. In doing so, the fundamental distinction between civilian and military targets must be front and center. All feasible precautions must be taken to spare civilians. Attacks must remain proportional to the wider damage they inflict. Persons not exercising a continuous combat function in an armed group can only be targeted when taking a direct part in hostilities. At their core, these rules have the paramount aim of effectively protecting civilians. International human rights law exists to protect the equality and dignity of every human being, even in times of war. Law exists to defend values central to our societies and to our world. Simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and their surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, as applicable, international humanitarian law. It is difficult to conceive how, in these circumstances, such attacks could possibly conform with the key principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack under international humanitarian law. If the attacker is unable to assess the compliance of the attack with binding rules of international law, notably the likely impact on civilians, then the attack should not be carried out. International humanitarian law prohibits the use of booby-trap devices in the form of apparently harmless portable objects which are specifically designed and constructed to contain explosive material. It is a war crime to commit violence intended to spread terror among civilians. I call again for an independent, thorough, and transparent investigation into the circumstances of these explosions. Those who ordered and carried out these attacks must be held to account. Let me be clear. This method of warfare may be new and unfamiliar, but international humanitarian and human rights law apply regardless and must be upheld. These attacks occurred amidst hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, which since 8 October last year have caused civilian casualties on both sides. According to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, figures that were released in August, over 500 people have been killed, over 2,400 injured, and according to IOM, over 110,000 displaced in Lebanon. The government of Israel reported 48 people killed in Israel and over 63 people displaced in the context of these hostilities. The last 24 hours have seen intensified cross-border military action in Lebanon and Israel. This tragic situation cannot be seen in isolation. It is bound up with the war in Gaza, the spiraling violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Israel's continued occupation of Palestinian territory. The heightened risk of further atrocity crimes remains. As repeatedly stated, the humanitarian situation for 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza is catastrophic. Over 1,200 people were killed on 7 October in Israel. In Gaza, over 100 hostages are still held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Over 40,200 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed as a result of the intensive Israeli offensive, and over 95,500 injured in Gaza, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. I'm outraged by this inconceivable toll of human suffering. For the UN and other humanitarian responders, ongoing hostilities, access constraints, attacks on staff and facilities, and damaged infrastructures, along with the deteriorating security situation, including looting and frequent Israeli-issued evacuation orders, are key factors obstructing the delivery of sufficient life-saving aid across the Gaza Strip. Ending the war in Gaza and averting a full-blown regional conflict is an absolute and urgent priority. I call for an immediate ceasefire and for continuous humanitarian access to be ensured throughout the Strip. I urge the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held in Gaza. The arbitrary detention by Israel of thousands of Palestinians must end. The wider situation of illegality across the occupied Palestinian territory, deriving from Israel's policies and practices, as so clearly spelled out by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion in July, must be comprehensively addressed. Mr. President, disrespect for international law is a matter of international peace and security, the core obligation of this Council, with implications beyond these countries and this region, beyond these countries and this region. States have constructed international human rights and humanitarian law precisely for moments like these, when life, dignity, and our very humanity are at risk. As such, states must not, cannot accept blatant disregard for international law, including binding decisions of the Security Council and orders of the International Court of Justice. They must not, cannot allow the hollowing out of international law and its protective core, neither in this nor in any other situation around the world. All states, particularly those with influence, must do everything they can to ensure full respect for international law. Just over 10 days ago, in my address to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, I urged the rejection of a new normal of endless, vicious military escalation and increasingly alarming, technologically advanced methods of warfare. The warnings from multiple actors against an all-out war in the region have been clear and consistent. It would benefit no one. Continuing on this path of inflamed war rhetoric on all sides and reckless military escalation only leads to further devastation. I urge Israel and Hezbollah to cease hostilities immediately. The specter of this region's past, the unending cycles of conflict, the human rights grievances and causes of which have been ignored and trampled on, is palpable and omnipresent. The complexity of this moment and the stakes for people everywhere demand much more from the international community to achieve an enduring peace. This crisis requires political courage and leadership. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Türk for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I thank Mrs. De Carlo and Mr. Turk for their briefing, and I acknowledge and welcome the presence of His Excellency Minister Abdullah Abu Habib among us in this meeting. My country has called for this urgent meeting in light of the alarming escalation in Lebanon on September 17 and 18. These tragic events have resulted in dozens of deaths and thousands of injuries following the remote detonation of small communication devices across the country. The perpetrator is well known. We strongly condemn this Israeli attack. Such actions represent a blatant violation of Lebanon's sovereignty, of the UN Charter, of the international law, and of Resolution 1701 and 2749. Algeria stands in full solidarity with Lebanon during these difficult times, and we extend our deepest condolences to the government and to the resilient people of Lebanon. And we commend the Lebanese authorities for their measured and responsible handling of this grave crisis, preventing further escalation. Mr. President, these acts of aggression amount to war crimes. The deliberate and discriminate nature of these Israeli strikes has caused terror among civilians, with densely populated areas being targeted. This dangerous precedent turns civilian devices into bombs, threatening the safety of all and posing a significant threat. This precedent opens a dangerous Pandora box. What will happen if such unfamiliar tactics are replicated by terrorist groups? While the international community calls for de-escalation, Israel pulls the region toward war, expanding hostilities from the Blue Line into the entire Lebanese territory. The Israeli officials have openly threatened to launch a large-scale war in Lebanon. These attacks were followed by statements, official statements, praising the so-called positive result. The airstrike against Beirut this morning are another proof that the Israeli occupying power is not at all interested in peace. So, do Israeli occupying authorities truly seek peace with their neighbors? Are they genuinely committed to implementing Resolution 2735? Are they really committed to a ceasefire in Gaza? Mr. President, the Security Council bears the solemn responsibility to uphold the principle enshrined in the UN Charter. The Security Council must enforce its resolution. Resolution 1701 must be fully implemented without bias, and the Israeli occupier aggressions must cease, and it must withdraw from all occupied Lebanese territories. Only by ending the occupation that we could pave the way for lasting peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et nous saluons la tenue d'une réunion suite au développement extrêmement inquiétant au Liban et au-delà. Et je voudrais remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe, Carlo, ainsi que le haut-commissaire turc pour leurs interventions qui détaillent très précisément les événements de ces derniers jours. Et je salue la présence du ministre et bien entendu de tous les collègues. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse exprime sa profonde inquiétude face aux explosions des beepers et d'autres appareils de communication survenus mardi et mercredi. Nous condamnons le fait que ces explosions aient fait de nombreuses victimes parmi les civils, y compris des enfants. La lumière doit être faite sur les circonstances et les responsabilités. Et je tiens à présenter nos sincères condoléances à toutes les familles des victimes civiles ayant été blessées et tuées ces derniers jours. Nous sommes préoccupés par les conséquences plus amples de ces explosions pour la population civile. Elles ont semé la panique et la peur généralisée et engorgé les hôpitaux. À ce titre, je voudrais rendre hommage au personnel hospitalier et aux secouristes libanais pour leur engagement. Ces explosions, ainsi que l'intensification des hostilités des deux côtés de la ligne bleue, y inclut la frappe dans la banlieue sud de Beyrouth aujourd'hui, risquent de compromettre davantage la stabilité du Liban et de toute la région. Nous déplorons ici aussi les civils blessés et tués. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties, ainsi que ceux qui ont une influence sur elle, à faire preuve de la plus grande retenue afin d'éviter une escalade régionale majeure. Nous plaidons avec insistance pour un retour à la cessation totale des hostilités et exigeons l'application intégrale de la résolution 1701. Ce Conseil a réaffirmé ses demandes à l'unanimité il y a seulement 3 semaines. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties au respect du droit international humanitaire et notamment des principes de distinction, proportionnalité et précaution en toutes circonstances. War has rules, comme vient de le dire le haut-commissaire. La protection des civils est une obligation juridique qui doit être respectée. Nous rappelons aussi que les droits humains s'appliquent en tout temps. Le seul désir des dizaines de milliers de personnes déplacées des deux côtés de la ligne bleue est de retourner dans leur maison pour y vivre en paix. Leurs enfants, quant à eux, ne demandent rien d'autre que de pouvoir se rendre dans leurs écoles et jouer avec leurs amis. Une chose est pourtant absolument claire. Le dialogue et la désescalade sont les seuls moyens pour y parvenir. L'escalade militaire n'est pas la solution. Elle entraînerait la région dans l'abîme d'une guerre régionale. C'est pourquoi la Suisse soutient tous les efforts de médiation en cours. Des voies de paix et de raison doivent prévaloir dans l'intérêt de la population de toute la région. Enfin, et nous ne cesserons pas d'insister sur ce point, un cessez-le-feu à Gaza, ainsi que la libération des otages et un accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave sont nécessaires de toute urgence pour réduire les souffrances des civils et éviter une plus grande escalade régionale. Les négociations doivent urgemment se poursuivre et les parties doivent y participer de bonne foi. Ce Conseil doit assumer ses responsabilités et contribuer unis à une solution pacifique. La Suisse est prête à apporter sa contribution. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank U.S. Carlo and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk for their grim briefings today. I also welcome the participation of Foreign Minister Mr. Habib and the representatives of Syria, Iran, and Israel in this meeting. The Republic of Korea is shocked to witness the bloody and the devastating attacks in Lebanon, involving communication devices that caused thousands of casualties, including children. This unprecedented action signifies a deeply worrisome escalation in an already extremely volatile context. I would like to make the following points in this regard. First, we stress that under no circumstances can violations of international humanitarian law be tolerated. These indiscriminate attacks remotely targeted and seriously injured thousands of individuals without specific knowledge of who possessed the devices, their exact locations, or their surroundings at the time of the attack, at grocery stores, hospitals, and funerals. Such attacks raise serious concerns about whether the core principles of IHL, distinction, proportionality, and precaution, were upheld during these operations. Reports also indicate that the exploded devices, predominantly pagers and walkie-talkies, were harmless portable products which are prohibited from being used as booby traps under Article 7, Paragraph 2 of the amended Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This further calls into question the legality of the operations as highlighted by High Commissioner Turk in his briefing. We call on all stakeholders to immediately cease all violations of international humanitarian law. Second, the international community must come together in urgent and serious discussions to address the emerging risks posed by the unprecedented form of warfare witnessed this week. The attacks weaponized thousands of personal communication devices for remote detonated destruction, elucidating the alarming potential for any consumer electronics to be exploited and transformed into lethal weapons that transcend our imaginations. These incidents underscore the urgent need to review whether existing international frameworks are adequately equipped to prevent such abuses. Third, we call on all parties to respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Lebanon and accelerate diplomatic efforts to fully implement Resolution 1701 and pursue a long-term solution for durable peace. While the situation is undoubtedly hazardous, this resolution remains a cornerstone of regional stability and is essential for preventing further deterioration. We urge all parties to return to the fundamentals of the resolution, including full respect for the blue line and the establishment of an area free of any armed entities other than the Lebanese armed forces. Fourth, my delegation strongly urges all parties to exercise maximum restraint and prioritize de-escalation during this highly perilous period. Israel has recently added the safe return of displaced northern residents as a new objective of its military action, stating that operations will continue until they can return home. It also conducted airstrikes today in a densely populated area in Beirut, which reportedly killed at least 12 people and injured over 60, including civilians, with others buried under the rubble. Further escalation would probably result in far greater civilian casualties, increased threats to UNIFIL peacekeepers, and unparalleled regional security risks. Indeed, from the Blue Line to Gaza, the West Bank, Yemen, and Syria, the region is on the brink of widespread and massive war. Even a single misstep or miscalculation could trigger a catastrophic situation with grave consequences for the lives of millions that could extend far beyond the region. As we now truly stand at an inflection point, we once again call on all parties to return to the negotiating table with a particular urgency for a ceasefire in Gaza, which lies at the very heart of de-escalation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk, for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States remains of the view that a broader conflict in the Middle East is neither desirable nor inevitable. But the actions various actors take in the coming days will, once again, determine how the situation evolves. It is imperative that even as facts emerge about the latest incidents, in which, I reiterate, the United States played no role, all parties refrain from any actions which could plunge the region into a devastating war. The Security Council cannot ignore the origins of this particular conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Prior to Hamas's brutal terrorist attack, quiet had largely been maintained along the Blue Line for 18 years, since the adoption of Resolution 1701 in 2006. This stability was shattered on October 7 and 8, when Israel was attacked without provocation by non-state armed groups in Lebanon. And for the past 11 months, the people of Lebanon have suffered the devastating consequences of this conflict, which is not their own. More than 100,000 Lebanese civilians and more than 65,000 Israeli civilians have been displaced. Civilians on both sides of the Blue Line have seen their homes destroyed and their fields and orchards burned. Hezbollah, which receives extensive training, arms, and financing from Iran, took these actions in solidarity with Hamas, not for Lebanon or the Lebanese people. And for the past 11 months, Hezbollah has continued to bombard communities in northern Israel on a near daily basis, again, in support of Hamas and Iran's broader campaign to threaten Israel. Hezbollah's sustained attacks, presence along the Blue Line, and entrenchment in southern Lebanon also put Israeli and Lebanese civilians at risk. Israel has a right to defend itself against Hezbollah's attacks. No member of this council facing a terrorist organization on its border would tolerate daily rocket attacks on its territory and the displacement of tens of thousands of its people. We expect all parties will comply with international humanitarian law and take all reasonable steps to minimize harm to civilians, especially those in densely populated areas. Continued escalation of the violence across the Blue Line will not create the conditions for displaced Israeli and Lebanese civilians to return to their homes in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. Rather, the United States continues to believe a diplomatic resolution is the only way to create the conditions for displaced Lebanese and Israeli civilians to return to their homes with safety and security. And we will continue to pursue this goal. Iran, through its sustained supply of weapons and personnel to Hezbollah, in blatant disregard and defiance of the call for disarmament in Resolutions 1559 and 1701, and in violation of the latter's legally binding arms embargo, appears to have a different agenda. Over many years, the United States has committed substantial resources to humanitarian efforts in Lebanon and supported independent institutions such as the Lebanese Armed Forces and Internal Security Forces. Equally significant, the Security Council has clearly and repeatedly expressed its desire to see the full authority of the Lebanese government extended throughout Lebanon's territory. And it has emphasized its strong support for the aspirations of the Lebanese people to live in peace, free from foreign meddling. Every member of this council has a responsibility to help Lebanon's people avoid further tragedy. to support diplomatic efforts that would help restore calm along the Blue Line, which again would enable civilians in southern Lebanon and northern Israel to return to their homes, and to also press Iran to cease its destabilizing and dangerous use of Hezbollah to undermine regional security in a way that puts the Lebanese people in danger. This is the path toward greater regional stability, and the United States will continue to do everything possible to support de-escalation and an enduring diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢阿尔及利亚要求召开此次会议，欢迎黎巴嫩外长哈比卜参加会议。我认真听取了迪卡洛副秘书长和图尔克人权高专的通报。中方对黎巴嫩境内数千台巡呼机、对讲机等通讯设备被远程操控，同时发生爆炸，造成数千民众伤亡，深感震惊，深表关切。在街头玩耍的孩子失去眼睛，在超市购物的母亲手脚致残，在上班途中的医生身负重伤。这种惨状让人不忍想象。通过远程操控通讯工具发动无差别袭击，造成大规模平民伤亡，制造社会恐慌，这样的事情在历史上闻所未闻。这种行为无疑是对一国主权和安全的严重侵犯，是对国际法，特别是国际人道法的公然违反，是对生命的漠视和践踏。袭击手段之残忍，性质之恶劣，令人发指，必须予以最强烈的谴责。截止目前，尚无人宣布对此次袭击负责，但各方对肇事者已做出了基本一致的判断。我们呼吁对事件进行全面及时的调查，追究策划者和实施者的责任。当前，中东地区局势岌岌可危，以色列在加沙的军事行动仍在持续，已夺去4万多巴勒斯坦民众的生命。以色列同时还在不断加剧黎以边境地区的紧张局势。我们注意到有关分析指出，此次远程操控袭击预示着大规模军事行动的开始。我们也注意到真主党领导人的最新表态。我们对黎以局势可能进一步升级深表担忧，呼吁所有各方保持最大限度的克制，特别呼吁以色列放下使用武力的执念，立即停止在加沙的军事行动，立即停止侵犯黎巴嫩主权和安全的行为，立即停止可能将地区拖入新的浩劫的冒险行径。我们强烈敦促对以色列有影响的国家拿出实际行动，制止以色列在错误的道路上越走越远。我们支持安理会采取一切必要行动，为缓和黎以局势、维护中东地区和平稳定做出最大努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for their briefing today. This past year has seen continuous and devastating violence across the region. Civilians have suffered on a dreadful scale on both sides of the Blue Line. The explosions in Lebanon this week and Israel's strike in southern Beirut today are the latest in a deadly cycle of violence, and we are deeply concerned by civilian casualties resulting from those incidents. That children were among them is particularly distressing. Our condolences go to the families of the civilians killed. My Foreign Secretary made our view clear last night. We need an immediate ceasefire on both sides. We are working in lockstep with our allies to de-escalate tensions and end this destructive cycle. We want to see the implementation of a political plan based on UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which allows both Israeli and Lebanese civilians to return to their homes and live in peace and security. We are ready to play our role in a diplomatic process to achieve that. President, let us be clear. Hezbollah launched an unprovoked attack on Israel on 8 October 2023. Since then, Israel has faced a near daily barrage of Hezbollah rockets. We are resolute in our support for Israel's right to defend its citizens against such threats. However, in doing so, international humanitarian law must be fully respected and all possible steps taken to avoid civilian casualties. Lebanese Hezbollah's aggression has been fueled by Iran and its continued destabilization of the Middle East, including through its support to partners and proxies. Iran supplies advanced weaponry in contravention of multiple Security Council resolutions, only prolonging the suffering of the Lebanese people. While Hezbollah and Iran continue to undermine Lebanon's future, the UK is providing practical support to bolster its stability and security. This includes funding and training to both the Lebanese armed forces and internal security forces, as well as humanitarian assistance to vulnerable communities, including in the south of Lebanon. President, now is the time for calm heads and an urgent focus on an immediate ceasefire to create the space for negotiations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo et Monsieur Turc pour leurs interventions et je tiens à saluer la présence parmi nous du ministre des Affaires étrangères du Liban. La France exprime son inquiétude à la suite des explosions d'appareils de télécommunications les 17 et 18 septembre au Liban. En effet, le risque d'une guerre ouverte et aux conséquences potentiellement dramatiques s'accroît chaque jour. Une telle perspective doit absolument être évitée. Il est urgent que toutes les parties travaillent à une désescalade. La résolution 2749, adoptée le 28 août pour renouveler le mandat de la FINUL, le demande avec clarté. Elle appelle tous les acteurs concernés à prendre des mesures immédiates en vue d'une désescalade et elle exige la pleine mise en œuvre du cadre reconnu par tous, à savoir la résolution 1701, y compris le retour à une cessation complète des hostilités. Ces résolutions doivent être respectées par tous. Dans cet objectif, nous demandons aux autorités israéliennes de faire preuve de la plus grande retenue après leurs déclarations récentes sur leurs opérations militaires au Liban. Nous rappelons aussi notre exigence que le Hezbollah cesse immédiatement ses attaques contre le territoire israélien. Il est enfin indispensable que toutes les parties s'acquittent des obligations que leur impose le droit international humanitaire, notamment en matière de protection des civils. La France poursuit ses efforts pour identifier les conditions d'un accord en vue de revenir à une cessation des hostilités le long de la ligne bleue, en accord avec la résolution 1701, et pour assurer la sécurité des populations civiles en Israël comme au Liban. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Slovenia presidency for convening this urgent meeting requested by Algeria. We are grateful to Undersecretary General Samuel Di Carlo and the High Commissioner Volker Turk for their insights on this deeply concerning matter. We also acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lebanon, and representatives of Iran and Israel. Mr. President, Mozambique views the current situation in Lebanon with deep concern. The escalating cross-border hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel have significantly heightened regional tensions. We are particularly alarmed by the recent cyber attack in Beirut and other parts of the country, which resulted in the detonation of pages and other electronic devices. This unprecedented incident, occurring on September 17 and 18, has led to a tragic loss of lives and numerous injuries. We deeply deplore the deaths of civilians. The targeting of populated areas, including homes, vehicles, commercial establishments, and public spaces, is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Mozambique strongly condemns these attacks, which have resulted in at least 12 civilian fatalities and left thousands wounded. We note with grave concern that many of the casualties were not combatants but civilians, members of the Lebanon's Shia community engaged in non-military activities. The weaponization of civilian subjects is strictly prohibited under international law. The incident highlights the evolving nature of modern warfare, where cyber capabilities can be employed to inflict physical harm. The sophistication and audacity of this operation mark a dangerous escalation in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. We are deeply troubled by the potential ramifications of this attack, which may herald a new phase of conflict in Lebanon and the broader Middle East region. The unprecedented nature of this incident raises serious concerns about the future stability of the area. We strongly condemn these attacks as they bring a notable escalation in the region after months of mostly low-intensity conflict between the two contenders. Mozambique calls upon all parties to immediately cease all military and subversive activities. We also strongly emphasize the critical need for de-escalation to prevent further instability and the retaliatory actions. We urge all parties involved to strictly adhere to international law and Security Council resolutions. It is imperative to ensure the protection of civilians and the maintenance of peace and security in the region. In conclusion, Mr. President, Mozambique reiterates its commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter and stands ready to support all efforts towards peaceful resolution of conflicts and the protection of civilian lives. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank Algeria for requesting this urgent meeting. I also thank USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for the updates provided, and welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Bou Habib, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon, in today's meeting. I also acknowledge the participation of the permanent representatives of Israel, Iran, and Syria in our meeting. Mr. President, Guyana is alarmed by the reports of well-coordinated, widespread lethal attacks earlier this week across Lebanon and Syria, where pagers and other communication devices were transformed into deadly weapons. These attacks were apparently aimed at specific targets, but ultimately were indiscriminate in their effect, as many of the detonations occurred in crowded areas. The result, according to the Minister of Health of Lebanon, is that 37 persons have died, including 2 children, and more than 3,000 injured. We are also deeply concerned about the strike carried out this morning by Israel in a densely populated area in Beirut, which also resulted in the deaths of at least 14 persons and injury to more than 50. Any attack causing harm to civilians must be thoroughly investigated to establish the circumstances, attribute responsibility for the harm caused, and hold to account the perpetrators. The ongoing and intensifying attacks on Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity will only serve to escalate the already tense situation in Lebanon and further heighten the risk of widening the violence in the Middle East region. Mr. President, the situation in the Middle East has become untenable. Too many parties are poised for war. We have heard on many occasions of the diplomatic efforts underway and the need for the Council to support these efforts. We commend those efforts and believe they are operating in good faith. However, given the time that has elapsed since Resolution 2735, without a deal for a ceasefire in Gaza, and the increasing horrific events that continue to occur, we do not believe that all parties in this conflict are operating in good faith. The plain and simple truth is that there is a common thread running across the region in the chaos and destruction that has upended the lives of civilians. There is one party that has chosen over and over again to take escalatory action at every opportunity, to abandon diplomatic negotiations while breaching the rule of international law and humanitarian law. Mr. President, Guyana again calls on countries of the region to fully comply with their international obligations and to uphold the principle of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We demand that all parties adhere to international law, including international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. It is imperative that there be a return to maximum restraint and an abandonment of rhetoric that only serves to inflame. We call on those with considerable influence to do more. They can and must exert maximum pressure to direct us away from this path that can lead to unimaginable agony in Lebanon and the wider region. A ceasefire in Gaza to end the immense suffering in the Strip is at the heart of de-escalating the increasing tensions in the region. Mr. President, the reality that we must confront is that lasting peace will not come through war. Violence will only doom us all to a cycle of escalating attacks, death, and destruction. The people of the Middle East are no less deserving of stability and security. Leaders of the region must recommit to dialogue and to a peaceful resolution to this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, for their briefings. Japan is extremely concerned with the situation in the Middle East and is monitoring the escalation of tensions with grave concern, especially the incidents this week where a large number of communication devices exploded across Lebanon and Syria, reportedly killing dozens of people and injuring thousands. We are concerned that children were among the victims, including those reportedly killed. Mr. President, Japan urges all concerned actors to refrain from any further action or retaliation to avoid a further catastrophe in the region. The ongoing Gaza conflict has already inflamed regional tensions. No one desires another full-scale conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, and civilians always pay the highest price if such a situation arises. All parties must once again recall their commitment to the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 and return to a cessation of hostilities. The fact that these incidents happened in multiple places including densely populated areas, and caused civilian casualties is appalling. Civilians must be protected at all times in accordance with international law. We call for an urgent, thorough, and transparent investigations into the blasts. The exchange of fire across the Blue Line has expanded dramatically since October last year. In relation to this, Japan reiterates its strong support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages based on the outlines of Security Council Resolution 2735. We stress the need for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in the Middle East. We remain committed to making every diplomatic effort to end the violence and restore stability in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I thank Mr. Carlo and Mr. Turk for their briefings and welcome the presence of His Excellency the Foreign Minister of Lebanon and acknowledge the participation of the permanent representatives of Syria, Iran and Israel. The Council meets today against the backdrop of what it has warned about for months, the growing prospect of regional escalation. Earlier this week, widespread simultaneous explosions across Lebanon killed at least 40 people and injured thousands of others, including children. The images we have witnessed are distressing. We echo the sentiments outlined by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk. The simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location and their surroundings, violates international human rights law and, to the extent applicable, international humanitarian law. The large-scale consequences of such a widespread attack, including the large number of civilian casualties, were foreseeable. Such action also reflects a worrying disregard for established norms and IHL. Now, there must be an independent and transparent investigation as to how these consumer electronic devices were turned into bombs which were detonated in populated areas, impacting civilians and overwhelming Lebanon's health services. President, recent Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon serve as another escalation that exacerbates tensions, which we denounce. This takes place whilst the military wing of Hezbollah persists with its indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel. We also continue to condemn these actions. The lasting psychological impact of this violence on the local population on both sides of the Blue Line must not be underestimated. The people of the region cannot afford another war. We must do everything in our power to prevent further conflict. The protection of civilians is paramount. The devastating impact of the war in Gaza on the situation across the Blue Line and the risk of it spiraling into a wider conflict is greater than ever before. What should come next is clear. This Council must focus on prioritizing de-escalation and restraint across the region. This behavior must also be implemented by the relevant actors whose aggressive rhetoric and apparent inclination to further escalation only begets further hostilities. This Council must act in a decisive manner to ensure the full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712, 2720 and 2735. A ceasefire agreement must be reached without further delay. We call on all member states in the region and those with influence over the parties to redouble their efforts to this end. The fate of the region depends on it. For Lebanon, a political and diplomatic solution remains essential to de-escalate the situation and ensure long-term stability. The parties must immediately return to a cessation of hostilities and to recommit to the full implementation of Resolution 1701. A dramatic escalation in Lebanon only moves us further from this goal. In conclusion, President, the region is on the precipice of an all-out war. Cool heads must prevail. Peace must prevail. The only way this can be achieved is for all parties to exercise restraint, to de-escalate, and pursue peaceful solutions to all disputes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias. Señor presidente, quiero empezar por agradecer a Algeria por convocar esta reunión, reconocer la presencia del canciller de Líbano y también de las delegaciones de Israel, Siria e Irán en esta sala. Los hechos de extrema violencia suscitados en el Líbano en los últimos días son causa de alarma y de preocupación. El Ecuador agradece y toma nota de la información proporcionada por la Secretaria General Adjunta, Rosemary DiCarlo, y por el Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos, Volker Turk. La explosión de aparatos de comunicación en Líbano ha ocasionado decenas de muertes y centenas de heridos, y ha sumido a la población civil en el miedo. El derecho internacional humanitario debe ser respetado por todas las partes. La protección de los civiles es una responsabilidad inexorable de la comunidad internacional. En esta línea, son condenables los bombardeos y el lanzamiento de misiles y drones armados, así como el uso indiscriminado de explosivos plantados en aparatos de comunicación en áreas pobladas. Estos actos son una violación flagrante del derecho internacional humanitario y del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, que debe ser objeto de una investigación independiente para determinar las responsabilidades. Es pertinente la mención a la resolución 1701, examinada en otro ítem de agenda, pues combina el cese definitivo de hostilidades en el sector de la línea azul. Ecuador hace eco del llamado al secretario general para que las partes observen máxima contención para evitar una escalada de las tensiones en la región. La espiral de violencia desencadenada podría tener consecuencias impredecibles, cuya afectación recaerá, como siempre, principalmente en la población civil. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, мы поддерживаем инициативу Алжира по созыву сегодняшнего заседания в связи с очередным опаснейшим витком эскалации в регионе Ближнего Востока. Мы внимательно изучили озабоченности Ливана и Ирана, изложенные в распространенных накануне письмах. С тревогой выслушали доклады заместителя генерального секретаря ООН Розмари DiCarlo и Фолькера Тюрка о ситуации в Ливане. Приветствуем участие в сегодняшнем заседании министра иностранных дел Ливана. Господин председатель, к сожалению, разрушительные обстрелы, авиаудары и жестокие наземные зачистки вот уже почти год как стали печальной обыденностью для Ближнего Востока. Несмотря на протест международного сообщества, расширяется и возмутительная практика точечных ликвидаций. Казалось бы, в этом котле насилия уже не осталось действий, которые бы мы с вами раз за разом не осуждали в этом зале. Однако то, что на днях произошло в Ливане и Сирии, выводит эскалацию на Ближнем Востоке в новое высокотехнологическое измерение. И это крайне опасный поворот. В результате чудовищной провокации серии детонаций беспроводных устройств связи за последние дни погибли 37 человек, в том числе 2 детей, более 4000 человек получили ранения. Те, кто совершил это варварское преступление, не щадили никого. Взрывы прогремели в больницах, на рынках, улицах, в магазинах и аптеках. Известно, что это была скоординированная дистанционно управляемая операция, ответственность за которую формально никто на себя не взял. Но в регионе проанализировали факты и сделали на этот счет свои выводы. Расцениваем случившееся как террористический акт, создающий угрозу региональному миру и безопасности с непредсказуемыми последствиями для всего Ближнего Востока. Решительно осуждаем эту беспрецедентную атаку на дружественный Ливан и его граждан, которое представляет собой грубое нарушение его суверенитета и является серьезным вызовом международному праву. Выражаем искренние соболезнования семьям погибших и желаем скорейшего выздоровления пострадавшим. Те, кто стоят за этим преступлением, не могут не осознавать, что подобные попытки втянуть Ливан в региональную конфронтацию накаляют и без того турбулентную атмосферу в регионе. Очевидно, что организаторы этого беспрецедентного с точки зрения злонамеренного использования бытовых устройств нападения целенаправленно добивались разжигания масштабной вооруженной конфронтации, стремясь спровоцировать новую большую ближневосточную войну. Это уже не первая такая попытка. Она продолжает череду политических нападений и убийств в Ливане, Сирии и Иране, за часть из которых власти Западного Иерусалима взяли на себя ответственность. В этом ряду и самая масштабная за последний год бомбардировка Израилем юга Ливана, продолжавшаяся более 2 часов подряд, после которой был нанесен очередной удар по южной части Бейрута, в результате которого, по данным Минздрава Ливана, погибли 8 человек и еще 59 получили ранения. Весь мир облетели кадры, на которых запечатлены ужасный масштаб разрушения от израильского авиаудара. Решительно осуждаем подобные действия Западного Иерусалима и призываем все стороны к максимальной сдержанности, немедленному прекращению огня и полному выполнению резолюции Совета Безопасности 1701. Большая война на Ближнем Востоке ни в чьих интересах. Примечательно также, что спираль насилия явно подрывает активно рекламируемые администрацией Байдена усилия по прекращению огня в секторе Газа, а также по стабилизации обстановки на голубой линии в Ливане. Результаты такой псевдодипломатии как минимум весьма сомнительны. Вместо мира продолжающееся кровопролитие на оккупированной палестинской территории, убийство главы политбюро Хамас Хании, являвшегося главным переговорщиком по сделке с Израилем, и теперь первая в истории масштабная террористическая атака с применением информационно-телекоммуникационных технологий, повлекшая гибель людей. С учетом декларируемого Вашингтоном и его союзниками курса на использование ИКТ в наступательных военно-политических целях против других государств, очевидно, что именно их действия подвели нас к этапу, когда мы можем столкнуться с террористической угрозой, для которой задействуются бытовые приборы. С учетом того, что, согласно поступающей информации, речь идет об удаленном воздействии на электронику, причем из другой юрисдикции, считаем произошедшее крайне опасным прецедентом. О подобных рисках мы неоднократно предупреждали, в том числе на профильных ООНовских площадках, где обсуждается проблематика международной информационной безопасности. Предвидя, что ИКТ могут использоваться в деструктивных целях, Россия уже много лет продвигает идею формирования особого международного правового режима регулирования цифровой среды, который бы учитывал технические уязвимости, включая анонимность, трансграничность и наличие скрытых функций. К сожалению, Соединенные Штаты и их союзники неизменно выступают против любых обязательств в этой сфере, чтобы сохранить свободу рук. К чему это приводит, мы имеем возможность убедиться на примере теракта в Ливане. Если же говорить о последствиях для информационно-телекоммуникационной сферы, то подобные инциденты еще больше усугубляют и без того растущее недоверие государств к информационно-коммуникационным устройствам, произведенным в других странах. Это, в свою очередь, усиливает тенденцию к самоизоляции национальных инфраструктур в данной области и, как следствие, фрагментации информационного пространства, подрыву международных стандартов в этой области, разрушению цепочек поставок и расширению цифрового разрыва между развитыми и развивающимися странами. В случае с терактом в Ливане принципиальное значение имеет вопрос о происхождении использованных для взрыва электронных устройств. Необходим подробный отчет вовлеченных коммерческих структур по поводу безопасности их продукции. Хочу напомнить, что у государств в соответствии с профильными решениями Генеральной Ассамблеи есть обязательства по обеспечению целостности каналов поставки. Господин председатель, каким бы чудовищным ни являлся обсуждаемый сегодня эпизод с использованием ИКТ в террористических целях, международное сообщество не беспомощно перед лицом этой угрозы. Недавно по российской инициативе запущен глобальный межправительственный реестр контактных пунктов, который нацелен на предотвращение и урегулирование серьезных инцидентов в информационном пространстве, а также снижение напряженности в кризисных ситуациях. Этот инструмент специально разработан для того, чтобы не допускать эскалацию в цифровой сфере, которая рискует перелиться в реальный мир. Призываем все заинтересованные стороны, прежде всего Ливан, им воспользоваться. Ожидаем, что получатели возможного запроса со стороны Бейрута незамедлительно его рассмотрят и дадут ответ ливанским коллегам. Это имеет принципиально важное значение для установления всех обстоятельств, произошедшего в Ливане. Господин председатель, всем очевидно, что ключ к урегулированию нынешней беспрецедентной по своим масштабам эскалации на Ближнем Востоке лежит в прекращении кровопролития в секторе Газа, где количество жертв перевалило за 42 тысячи человек. Единственный выход – скорейшее установление режима прекращения огня, обмен заложниками и заключенными и организация беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа в анклав. Только так возможно будет перезапустить процесс мирного урегулирования палестинского вопроса на международно признанной базе, в основе которой лежит принцип двух государств для двух народов, в поддержку которого мы последовательно и неизменно выступаем. Со своей стороны готовы к взаимодействию со всеми, кто разделяет эти задачи. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I also thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and High Commissioner Mr. Volker Turk for their important briefing. We acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrant of Lebanon and the representative of Iran, Syria, and Israel in this meeting. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned over the significant deterioration of the security situation in Lebanon and North Israel. Instability and violence have increased across Lebanon over these past 3 days after a series of explosions of communication devices meant to be in the possession of members of Hezbollah. It has been reported that at least 37 people have been killed, with at least 2,931 people suffering injuries, and some of whom are in intensive care. Similar communication devices attack occurred in Syria, resulting in deaths and injuries. These attacks have been followed by intense strikes in southern Lebanon by Israeli warplanes, reportedly the heaviest aerial strikes since October 2023. We further note reports of Hezbollah's retaliatory missile and drone strikes in northern Israel on Thursday, killing 2 soldiers and injuring 9. We note with concern that these actions have definitely led to a further escalation in the cycle of violent attacks between the two parties and an exacerbation of tensions in an already volatile region with dire security and humanitarian consequences for civilians. There are reports that the communication devices explosion in Lebanon occurred in populated areas, including at a funeral, and that there are civilians, including children, among the dead and injured. Sierra Leone condemns the killing of civilians in these attacks, which, when carried out without taking into consideration the principle of distinction, is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. As we join the UN Secretary General urging the parties to exercise restraint, we remind the conflicting parties and those that enable them with complicity to comply with their obligations under international law to protect civilian and civilian infrastructure. Without accountability, the ongoing blatant violations of international law can only embolden the perpetrators and endanger the seeming specter of impunity that seems to characterize the Middle East conflicts. Mr. President, just yesterday, a member of the elders, former Prime Minister Ellen Clark, asked whether the Security Council is interested in implementing its own resolutions. Several reports for UNIFIL this year has informed the Council that Hezbollah and the Israel Defense Forces have been engaged in tit-for-tat exchanges of fire beyond the blue line since the 7th October attack, with the attacks initially unprovoked from Hezbollah. The breach of the 1701 resolution and the escalation of attacks on the back of inflammatory rhetoric and the movement of troops are deeply alarming as they continue to foment tensions which risk bringing the parties very close to all-out war. Separate from the war in Gaza, the security and safety of Israeli civilians in northern Israel must be of concern. Security Council Resolution 1701 must be respected by all, and the Council must be in a position to implement all of its resolutions. As the region grapples with the war in Gaza and the dire humanitarian crisis, we reject actions that may jeopardize the ongoing peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas and threats in regional and global peace and security. We call on countries in the region and elsewhere with influence to prevail upon both parties to desist from further attacks over the blue line and elsewhere. The impact of a full-blown conflict on the Lebanese people and economy will be completely devastating. The people of Lebanon have already gone through a lengthy and destructive war and periods of fragility, and this Council should do all it can to prevent a recurrence. As Lebanon seeks to stabilize its economy, we note efforts taken to pass a budget earlier this year, and we urge lawmakers to undertake governance and macroeconomic reforms needed to improve state authority and resource mobilization. We therefore call on the parties to use diplomatic channels, including United Nations good offices, to avoid further escalation and the risk of all-out war or wider devastating regional conflagration. In this regard, Sierra Leone commends UNIFIL for their relentless effort in maintaining channels of communications, as well as the physical intervention of peacekeepers. Events since October 7, 2023 have only underscored the importance of the mission's liaison and coordination mechanisms. We remain concerned over the impact of missile strikes on UNIFIL positions and injury to peacekeepers. We condemn all acts that endanger the lives of peacekeepers. We urge all parties to ensure the safety and security of UN personnel and respect the inviolability of UN premises. In conclusion, Sierra Leone continues to call for de-escalation and the need for the parties to consider the regional implications of their actions and to recommit to a cessation of hostilities. This includes a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and a holistic approach to the release of hostages and prisoners, and the implementation of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. First, I want to thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and High Commissioner Turk for their briefings. I welcome Minister Habib in the chamber, and I also welcome the representatives of Iran, Israel, and Syrian Arab Republic in the room. I would like to express our profound concern over the latest developments in the Middle East. Let me make 3 points in this regard. First, we condemn the recent series of explosions across Lebanon and also in Syria. This unprecedented attack caused civilian deaths and injuries, instilling fear and further destabilizing the region. These explosions were devastatingly coordinated, leaving hundreds of people, among them children, injured or dead. It has created a climate of terror. We are stepping in a dangerous new territory, and as new technology is being used and developed, we underline the need to respect existing legal obligations. Civilian objects should not be weaponized. The international law is clear. Use of booby traps is prohibited. As underlined by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and their surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, to the extent applicable, international humanitarian law. We call on all parties to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We support an independent and transparent investigation. Secondly, tensions between Lebanon and Israel, especially along the Blue Line, are alarming. This includes heavy exchanges in recent days, as well as today's strike in Beirut and the subsequent retaliation. We deplore the loss of civilian lives. We once again call for restoration of cessation of hostilities and full implementation of the Resolution 1701. We are appalled by the heavy impact on civilian infrastructure and civilians, many of whom have been displaced. It was violence that drove them from their homes in the first place. Additional violence will not bring them back. If anything, it will make their safe return an even harder task. Thirdly, we are in this situation because our resolutions have not been complied with. We call on conclusion of agreement on ceasefire and the release of hostages. We continue to call for maximum restraint by all actors in the region. The cycle of violence is increasing speed, and it risks escalating into a wider conflict. We call on all parties, both state and non-state actors, to de-escalate and refrain from any further retaliatory actions. We repeat our call on states with influence on those actors to use this influence to encourage utmost restraint and to prevent any further deterioration of the situation on the ground. This includes the troubling escalatory rhetoric of different countries and actors. Colleagues, Security Council must be united in upholding international law and maintaining peace and security. The situation between Lebanon and Israel and the war in Gaza threaten to spark a wider conflict, especially with Israel's stated intention to expand military action beyond its northern border. We have to be clear. Such action would be an attack on a sovereign state. We must prevent this by promoting diplomatic solutions that offer long-term stability. The region cannot endure another war, and we must act before the situation spirals beyond control. For almost a year, we have been cautioning from provocations and escalations, further aggravating the situation in the Middle East. We have said it before. Any of these escalations can become a conflict with a life of its own or engulf the whole region in a complex war. It is for this reason we believe diplomacy must be the only path forward. And Slovenia therefore particularly welcomes the Lebanese foreign minister's participation at this meeting today. Thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Abdallah Bouhabib, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank the Undersecretary Di Carlo and the High Commissioner Turk for their presentations, as well as thank all members of the Council for acknowledging the severity and devastating consequences of the electronic attacks on peace and security of the fate of the humanity. سيد الرئيس، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، لم يعد أحد في هذا العالم بأمان بعد الهجمات الإلكترونية التي حصلت مؤخرا في لبنان وفاقت الخيال والتصور، وما نتج عنها من ضحايا مدنيين أبرياء بالآلاف من الجرحى، ومنهم أيضا ضحايا من الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ. إن مسؤولية مجلس الأمن ليست فقط تجاه الأبرياء اللبنانيين الذين سقطوا ظلما، بل تجاه الإنسانية جمعاء. فإذا مر هذا العمل الإرهابي في مجلسكم مرور الكرام بلا محاسبة وتم تجهيل الفاعل وعدم ردعه وإدانته وإرغامه على وقف هكذا اعتداءات، فإن مصداقية هذا المجلس والقانون الدولي وشرعة حقوق الإنسان في خطر محدق. إن تقبلكم لما حدث يعني موافقتكم على فتح صندوق العجائب، حيث ستحظو دول ومجموعات متطرفة حظو إسرائيل، وتستهدف المدنيين من كل حدب وصوب بهذه التكنولوجيا الفتاكة، ولن يتمكن أحد من منع استخدامها مستقبلا لاستهداف طائرات مدنية وقطارات وخلافه لقتل المدنيين وترويعهم بصورة عشوائية دون تمييز. أليس هذا الإرهاب بعينه عندما يتم استهداف شعب بكامله في مدنه وشوارعه وأسواقه ومحلاته وبيوته وهم يقضون احتياجاتهم ولا يقاتلون على الجبهات؟ يكفي لفهم ما حصل أن نتأمل بهوية الضحايا، فهل أصبح المطلوب اليوم إبادة وإعاقة الشعب اللبناني كعقاب جماعي؟ ومن حقنا أن نسأل: أليس هذا السيناريو الذي صرح به كبار المسؤولين الإسرائيليين؟ انظروا إلى بشاعة ما حصل في هذه الصور. سأعتذر عن هذه الصورة. والإضاءة على ما حصل ونتائجه في يوم الثلاثاء موافق 17/9/2024 نفذت إسرائيل هجوما إلكترونيا واسع النطاق استهدف الآلاف الأجهزة المحمولة المعروفة ببيجرز، مما أدى إلى تفجيرها. في اليوم التالي قامت مرة أخرى بتفجير مئات الأجهزة اللاسلكية من نوع آخر، إضافة إلى قيامها بتاريخ 19/9 بترويع سكان العاصمة بيروت وكافة المناطق بتحليق الطيران الحربي على علو منخفض وخرقه المتكرر لجدار الصوت، مما أدى إلى حالات هلع لا سيما لدى الأطفال. وبتاريخ اليوم نفذت إسرائيل اعتداء صاروخيا في عمق أكثر المناطق اكتظاظا بالسكان من الضاحية الجنوبية للعاصمة بيروت، فدمرت مبنى سكنيا وأوقعت في حصيلة أولوية 14 ضحية منهم أطفال و66 جريحا. هذه الهجمات أدت حتى الآن إلى وفاة عشرات الأشخاص بينهم أطفال ونساء وإصابة آلاف الجرحى ومنهم مئات في حالة خطرة، بالإضافة إلى مئات آخرين تعرضوا لتشوهات جسدية أو فقدوا أحد أطرافهم أو بصرهم بالكامل. وقد ترك هذا الهجوم المستشفيات والطواقم الطبية في لبنان في حالة طوارئ غير مسبوقة، مستنفذا قدرتها الاستيعابية، كما أثار الاعتداء حالة واسعة من الرعب والهلع بين المدنيين في كافة المناطق اللبنانية. تأتي هذه الهجمات التي تمثل سابقة خطرة وغير مسبوقة في تاريخ الحروب في أعقاب سلسلة من التصريحات الإسرائيلية بشن حرب واسعة على لبنان وإعادته إلى العصر الحجري. ولم تكتفي إسرائيل بهذه الهجمات فحسب، بل تبعتها بإصدار تصريحات رسمية وتغريدة لمستشار رئيس حكومتها تم حذفها لاحقا بسرعة تؤكد ضلوعها وتحقيقها نتائج إيجابية من هذا العدوان، مما نسف بصورة متعمدة مهمة الوسطاء الدوليين الذين يعملون على وقف لإطلاق النار في غزة وجنوب لبنان وكافة محاولات الحكومة اللبنانية لخفض التسعيد وضبط النفس. وفي هذا السياق نشدد على أن اللجوء إلى تفجير آلاف أجهزة اتصال عن بعد بشكل جماعي وغادر دون اعتبار لمن يحملها أو لمن يتواجد بالقرب منها يعد أسلوبا قتاليا غير مسبوق في وحشيته وإرهابه. إن استهداف آلاف الأشخاص من مختلف الفئات العمرية وفي مناطق واسعة ومكتظة بالسكان تشمل كافة المناطق اللبنانية أثناء ممارستهم لحياتهم اليومية في المنازل والشوارع وأماكن العمل ومراكز التسوق هو الإرهاب بعينه، وانتهاك صارح للقانون الدولي الإنساني وشرعة حقوق الإنسان، ويصنف من دون أدنى شك كجريمة حرب. فالبروتوكول الأول الإضافي لاتفاقية جنيف لعام 1949 والمتعلق بحماية ضحايا النزاعات المسلحة ينص في المادة 35 على حق أطراف النزاع في اختيار وسائل وأساليب القتال ليس مطلقاً، مما يعني أن استخدام التفجير الإلكتروني لأجهزة الاتصال كأسلوب للقتال وهو أسلوب غير تقليدي يجب أن يخضع للقانون الدولي والإنساني، لا سيما مبدأ الحماية، أي تأمين الحماية للسكان المدنيين حسب المادة 48، ومبدأ الاحتياط، أي أن يتخذ كل طرف في النزاع كافة الاحتياطات عند إدارة العمليات العسكرية لتجنب أحداث الخسائر في أرواح المدنيين، وإلحاق الخسائر بالممتلكات المدنية المادة 57. كذلك ينص البروتوكول الأول الإضافي في المادة 51 على حظر أعمال العنف أو التهديد بالعنف التي تستهدف نشر الذعر بين المدنيين، كما حذر في المادة 37 قتل الخصم أو إصابته أو أسره باللجوء إلى الغدر. كذلك حذر في المادة 85 استهداف مواقع خالية من وسائل الدفاع. وأيضا قامت إسرائيل من خلال هذا العدوان الإرهابي بخرق المبادئ الأساسية للقانون الدولي الإنساني لجهة عدم التمييز بين المدنيين والعسكريين، حيث استهدفت المدنيين بصورة عشوائية، كما أن عملها هذا لم يكن ما يبرره، إضافة لأنه لم يكن متناسبا. السيد الرئيس، لقد أصبح من الواضح أن إسرائيل لا تلتزم بالقانون الدولي والإنساني ولا بالقرارات الصادرة عن أجهزة الأمم المتحدة ومنها مجلس الأمن، وأنها لطالما تجاهلت وتتجاهل الشرعية الدولية وحقوق الإنسان لأنها اعتادت أن لا تحاسبها الدول على أفعالها، حيث تصدر مواقف خجولة تجاه ارتكاباتها لا تتعدى الأسف، مما يشجعها على الاستخفاف بقرارات الشرعية الدولية التي لم ينفذ أي منها بحق إسرائيل منذ العام 1948 أي قرار، فأصبحت الأخيرة دولة مارقة، ومع ذلك لا يمكن قبول هذه الحقيقة كأمر واقع، إذ لا يمكن السماح لاستمرار إسرائيل في الإفلات من العقاب والمحاسبة. فلم تتعلم إسرائيل شيئا من اجتياحاتها المتكررة للبنان على مدى عقود من الزمن، حيث لم تحصد سوى الخيبات والهزائم، وآخرها هروبها من لبنان عام 2000 تاركة ورائها سلاحها وعتادها. فالمغامرة الجديدة التي تبشرنا بها إسرائيل لن تكون سوى نسخة قبيحة عن سابقتها وتكرارا لما حققته الحرب العقيمة على غزة وأطفالها، أي البؤس والتطرف والدمار، وقد تؤدي أيضا إلى حرب إقليمية طاحنة تختلف عن كل سابقاتها من حيث رقعتها الجغرافية على امتداد الشرق الأوسط وأنواع الأسلحة الفتاكة والدقيقة وحجم الدمار وأعداد الضحايا. سيد الرئيس، لقد بحى صوت اللبنانيين حكومة وشعبا بأننا لسنا هواة حرب ولا سعاة ثأر، بل نطالب بالعدالة والحل الدبلوماسي وعودة النازحين إلى قراهم. فلتعلم إسرائيل مهما بلغت قوتها العسكرية والتكنولوجية بأنها لن تعيد نازحيها إلى قراهم بقوة السلاح، بل ستهجر من لم يتهجر بعد إذا وسعت اعتداءاتها، وبأن لا مكان لها في هذا الشرق إلا بالتصالح مع شعوبه وليس فقط مع حكامه، من خلال إعطاء الفلسطينيين حقوقهم المشروعة ودولتهم الموعودة من هذه المنظمة بالذات منذ أكثر من 75 عاما. فمهما طال الزمن وكثرت التضحيات ستعود الحقوق إلى أصحابها. لقد جئنا إليكم اليوم ليس فقط دفاعا عن لبنان وضحاياه الأبرياء، بل حفاظا على إنسانيتنا جمعاء، طالبين إدانة الهجمات الإسرائيلية الإرهابية بصورة واضحة وصريحة، وتحميل إسرائيل المسؤولية الكاملة على تخطيطها وتنفيذها وما تشكله من اعتداء سافر على سيادة لبنان وسلامة أراضيه وخرق صارخ لميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقرار 1701. ويطالب لبنان أيضا بوقف آلتها الحربية لتجنب اندلاع حرب إقليمية مدمرة والحفاظ على مصداقية الأمم المتحدة ودورها في صون الأمن والسلم الدوليين، والذي يظل لبنان مؤمنا بأهميته على الرغم من كل ما حدث ويحدث. لسنا نبحث اليوم عن قرارات جديدة تبقى حبرا على ورق كما جرت العادة بكل أسف بكل ما يتعلق بإسرائيل ومصالحها. السيد الرئيس، في الختام شكرا من القلب إلى الجزائر الشقيقة ممثلة المجموعة العربية في مجلس الأمن التي عودتنا على الوقوف إلى جانب لبنان ومساندته في السراء والضراء. إنني أناشد أعضاء هذا المجلس أن يقفوا على الجانب الصحيح من التاريخ وأن يدافعوا عن العدالة والسلام وأن يدعموا لبنان في سعيه لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار. لقد وصلنا اليوم إلى لحظة الحقيقة وجئنا لنضع أنفسنا بتصرف عدالة الأمم المتحدة ومصداقيتها أمام العالم أجمع. فإما يفرض هذا المجلس على إسرائيل وقف عدوانها وتطبيقها لقراري مجلس الأمن 1701 و2735 ووقف حربها على كل الجبهات وعودة النازحين إلى بلداتهم، وإما نكون شهود زور على الانفجار الكبير الذي تلوح تبشيره في الأفق. فاعلموا اليوم وقبل فوات الأوان بأنه لن يوفر شرقا ولا غربا. ساعة لا ينفع الندم ونعود جميعا إلى عصر الظلمات. الحرب من أمامكم والقرار 1701 و2735 في أدراج مجلسكم. الخيار لمجلسكم، فهل سيتحرك مجلسكم الكريم بسرعة وحسم فتقف طبول الحرب التي تدق أبواب الشرق الأوسط بأسره، أم سنبقى متفرجين على تدحرج كرة النار؟ الخيار لكم، فاختاروا ما بين السلام والنار. لقد أطلقت صرختي من على هذا المنبر وأكررها هذه المرة للمرة الثالثة، ونحن في خضم الصراع. أعطوا السلام فرصة، أعطوا السلام فرصة قبل فوت الأوان. ألم تشبع إسرائيل حروبا وقتلا ودمارا؟ ألم يحن الوقت بعد لاختصار المسافات والعذابات علينا جميعا لنزرع بذور مستقبل أفضل لشعوبنا ولنرفع أوزار هذا الصراع عن الأجيال القادمة؟ وشكرا.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bo Habib for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, I sit here in this council as I did on Monday, Thursday, and now Friday, defending Israel's right to exist, to defend ourselves. Also on Tuesday and Wednesday, we sat at the General Assembly for 2 days watching the Israel-bashing circus led by the Palestinian Authority as part of their diplomatic terrorism. Are there no other conflicts in the world? Are there no other pressing matters that require this Council's attention? Or is the UN's obsession with condemning Israel so consuming that it blinds you to everything else? We did not seek this war. We did not. On October 8th, while Israeli civilians were still being slaughtered in the south by Hamas, Hezbollah, I haven't heard you, Mr. Minister, mentioning Hezbollah even once in your speech. Hezbollah unleashed hundreds of rockets at our civilians in the north. This was not provoked. It was a calculated assault to show support for Hamas, a declaration made by Hassan Nasrallah himself. Since that day, over 8,000 rockets have rained down, 46 of our people have been murdered, 294 injured, and more than 60,000 remained displaced, unable to return to their homes in the north as Hezbollah attempts to burn them to the ground. Every day, Hezbollah's rockets deliberately target our civilians, attempting to destroy homes and force entire communities to flee in fear. Families have been torn apart. 12 Israeli Druze children who were playing soccer one moment were dead the next. And still, the terror continues every day. Where was the international community? Human rights? Nowhere. Every day, rockets, missiles, drones. Hezbollah's relentless attacks have forced innocent civilians, parents, children, the elderly, to abandon everything. They are now refugees within their own country, living in temporary shelters, unsure of when or if they will ever return to the places they once called home. This is not just the displacement of individuals, but of entire lives, memories, and futures. It has been nearly a year since they were forced to flee, and still they wait for the day when it will be safe to return. Israel will not allow this to continue. Our objective is very clear. We will restore security to our northern border, and we will bring our people home. It is our responsibility. The goal of returning our displaced citizens has been formally included in the objectives of this war. We will do whatever it takes to achieve this, and we will not allow Hezbollah's terror to dictate the future of our nation. If Hezbollah does not retreat from our border and back to the north of the Litani River through diplomatic efforts, Israel will be left with no choice but to use any means within our rights to defend our citizens and enable the evacuees of the north to return to their homes. Hezbollah has turned southern Lebanon into a war zone, using civilian homes as weapons depots and UNIFIL bases as launch points, digging tunnels beneath them and using innocent civilians as well as UN peacekeepers as the human shields. This is not just an attack on Israel. It is a crime against Lebanon itself. Hezbollah has brought untold suffering, not just to Israelis, but to the Lebanese people, who are also trapped in the grip of this terrorist organization. If this modus operandi sounds familiar, it is because the same is used by another terror organization, Hamas, also using civilians. Yet, the Lebanese foreign minister who sits here today could not find the courage to even mention Hezbollah. We know that is a problem. If we will sit together, we can achieve very fast agreements about everything. I'm not familiar with occupation of Israel in Lebanon. I'm not familiar with these major disputes. We can sit with your help and achieve some kind of a compromise. But we know that the real problem is not Lebanon. The real problem is Hezbollah. It is his government, after all, that bears the responsibility. They are incapable of implementing Security Council resolutions, nor preventing terrorist organizations from dragging their entire country into war. Minister Abdallah Abu Habib, Your Excellency, you have allowed a terrorist organization to create a state within your state, bringing ruin to your own people. Instead of blaming us, your peaceful neighbors, you should take action now to restrain Hezbollah and avoid greater escalation. If you continue to ignore Hezbollah's aggression, the pain and the suffering of the Lebanese people will be on your shoulders. Mr. President, while Israel is not seeking a wider conflict, I will be clear, we will not allow Hezbollah to continue its provocations. Their actions violate international law, and Israel will defend itself. We will not allow our people to live under constant threat, nor will we allow Hezbollah to use Lebanese territory as a launchpad for violence. For too long, we have called on this Council to enforce Resolutions 1701 and 1559. For too long, our calls have been ignored. For years, Israel has supplied data on Hezbollah's buildup in clear violation of Council resolutions, but to no avail. Hezbollah and its Iranian puppet masters must face real consequences for their actions. Hezbollah must be disarmed, and Iran must be held accountable for destabilizing the region. The world cannot afford to let Hezbollah's terror continue unchecked. We call on this Council to condemn Hezbollah and Iran and to designate Hezbollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as terrorist organizations. Words are no longer enough. This Council must act. For nearly a year, we have exercised restraint. We did, waiting for a diplomatic solution. And this is what we would prefer. We prefer, and we urge you, and we're thanking those who are trying to help this process. That's what we want. We have no desire for war, but we cannot continue to allow our people to bleed, nor can we abandon the 60,000 Israelis who have fled their homes. The outcome of this situation is clear. Hezbollah will be pushed back from the border, exactly as stated in Resolution 1701. The question that remains before us is how this will be achieved and at what cost. The devastation caused by Hezbollah's actions goes beyond human lives. Over 800 fires have been ignited by Hezbollah's rockets, burning more than 50,000 acres of forests, nature reserves, and agricultural land. Entire ecosystems have been destroyed. This is not just an environmental disaster. It is an act of war against the land itself. And yet, where is the UN? Where are the voices of condemnation for those who claim to care so deeply about the environment? The UN is about to convene its summit of the future. We know that climate and the environment are central themes, but where is the concern for the fires Hezbollah has set? Where is the outrage for the destruction of our forests, your forest in Lebanon? UN officials cannot even mention Hezbollah in their statements. This hypocrisy cannot go unchallenged. As I stated just 24 hours ago, Iran is the real instigator behind all of this. Hezbollah does not act alone. It is a puppet, and Iran is pulling the strings. Iran arms them, funds them, and directs their operations. Iran's influence stretches far beyond our borders, from Lebanon to Syria, from Yemen to Iraq. If Gaza could have been the Singapore of the Middle East, Beirut should have been the Paris of the Middle East. But we see that wherever Iran is involved, chaos and destruction inevitably follow. Mr. President, Israel will do whatever is necessary to protect its citizens. We will bring our displaced people back to their homes in the north. We will restore security, and we will bring calm to our nation. This is our right, and we will exercise it fully. The Security Council should stand by Israel as we seek to accomplish this, because this is not just Israel's fight. It is a fight against terrorism, against instability, and against the forces that seek to destroy peace in the region. When the time comes, do not look to us for blame in protecting our people. Now is your time to speak up and act before we have to. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, thank you, Mr. President, for convening this emergency meeting. We thank Lebanon and Algeria for requesting this meeting. We also thank Ms. DiCarlo and Mr. Turk for their briefing. We welcome the presence of His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Abu Habib, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Immigrants of Lebanon, in this meeting. Mr. President, member of the Security Council, this meeting is requested to address systematic and provocative act of terror committed by occupying regime of Israel on September 17 and 18 in Beirut, Lebanon, as well as in a part of Syria, deliberately targeting innocent civilians, including children. The method of this barbaric attack was unprecedented, as it was covertly handheld communication device was deliberately detonated, resulting in loss of at least 37 civilian lives and injuring thousands more, most likely of them injured from their eyes, including Iran's ambassador. Despite concerns by international community, this regime continues its aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon and Syria. Just this morning, an air strike targeted the residential areas in Zahia, a densely populated suburb of Beirut, causing civilians casualties and loss of life. Mr. President, targeting thousands of people across various age groups in densely populated area of Beirut, whatever in their home, streets, workplaces, or shopping centers, is a clear act of terrorism and a flagrant violation of international law, in particular international humanitarian human rights law and numerous resolutions of this body, especially resolution on the protection of civilians. These widespread and systematic crimes aimed at mass killing, severe suffering, and serious injury to civilians constitutes crimes against humanity. Reports suggest that Israel intended to kill at least 5,000 civilians, while some devices either undistributed or deactivated. The Israeli barbaric attack has left Lebanon hospitals and medical staff in an unprecedented state of emergency, and attacks have sparked widespread fear and panic across Lebanon. Undoubtedly, Israel bears full responsibility for the perpetration of such horrific crimes. The repercussions of this attack extend far beyond Lebanon's border. The targeting of communication devices in the heart of Beirut sends a clear message to the international community. Israel is willing to commit any crime, no matter how extreme, to violate and attack the sovereignty and security of countries in the region and threaten regional and international peace and security. The Islamic Republic of Iran condemns in the strongest terms these horrible and barbaric attacks. We extend our deepest condolences and sympathies to the people and the government of Lebanon and the families of the victims of this heinous terrorist attack. We wish a swift and full recovery to the injured and reaffirm our unwavering solidarity with our Lebanese brothers and sisters. Mr. President, the attack on our ambassadors is a blatant violation of international law and diplomatic norms. The protection of diplomatic personnel is a fundamental principle of international relations. The Israeli terrorist attack has flagrantly violated the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and 1973 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against International Protected Persons, including diplomatic agents. We will rigorously pursue accountability for the attack on our ambassador in Lebanon. We reserve our right under international law to take all necessary measures to respond to this egregious violation. Unfortunately, this Council has remained silent in the face of ongoing Israeli aggression and illegal actions, including the attack on Iran's diplomatic mission in Syria on 1st April 2024. Now again, this regime has crossed a red line by targeting our ambassador. Mr. President, let us not forget that these atrocious crimes against the people of Lebanon are part of a broader pattern of aggressive policy by Israeli regime. The Islamic Republic of Iran has repeatedly warned about the serious repercussions of malicious activities of the Israeli regime in the region. For the sake of regional peace, security, and the so-called ceasefire talks, the Islamic Republic of Iran has consistently shown maximum restraint. However, Israeli atrocities, from the ongoing genocidal war against the Palestinian people and occupation of Palestinian territories to illegal strike in Syria and Lebanon, on the attack on Iran diplomatic mission in Syria, and cowardly assassination of Palestine's former prime minister and the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, demonstrate an Israeli relentless commitment to destabilizing the region and threatening international peace and security. Mr. President, the gravity of Israeli atrocities against the people of Lebanon must be recognized not just as an attack on Lebanon, but as a threat to peace and security across the region. We must ask ourselves, how much longer will the international community allow such atrocious crime to go unchecked? For decades, Israel has engaged in a pattern of aggressive actions aimed at destabilizing the region, whether through military operation, sabotage, or direct attack on civilians. This continuous aggression endangers the peace and security of the Middle East, fueling cycles of violence and further entrenching conflict. Regrettably, the Security Council has failed in its duty to maintain international peace and security. Israel's malevolent activities are often overlooked or outright supported by certain Western nations. Unwavering political, military, and economic support provided to Israel by the United States and its allies emboldens this regime to continue its violations without fear of accountability. This unconditional support, coupled with the deliberate blocking of any international effort to hold Israel responsible, has created an environment of impunity. The international community must not ignore the role of the Western countries, in particular the United States and UK, play in enabling Israel's aggressions. These heinous crimes once again shown the Israeli leadership has no intention to adhering to international norms or the so-called ceasefire negotiations, frequently referenced by the United States in this council as being near resolution. The international community, and particularly this council, has a duty to confront not only the direct perpetrators of such crimes, but also those who provide them with the means and political cover to commit them. The failures of this body to hold Israel accountable has only emboldened the regime, allowing it to continue its aggressive and unlawful behavior. The Islamic Republic of Iran stands firmly with the government and the people of Lebanon, and we will not rest until those responsible for these atrocities are held accountable. We reaffirm our commitment to upholding the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. However, it is incumbent upon this Council to act to stand up for justice, for peace, and the protection of innocent civilians. In conclusion, Mr. President, I categorically reject the baseless accusation made by the representative of Israeli regime against my country. The representative of this terrorist regime, led by a notorious prime minister who is under arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for the commission of war in Gaza, consistently relies on lies and disinformation to evade responsibility and to shift blame onto others. The very foundation of this regime is rooted in aggression, occupation, terror, and genocide. So nobody will take seriously these unfounded claims. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. السيد الرئيس، أدلي بهذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية في الأمم المتحدة في نيويورك، وأشكركم على استجابتكم للطلب الذي تقدمت به الجزائر الشقيقة العضو العربي في مجلس الأمن لعقد هذه الجلسة الطارئة في ضوء التصعيد الأخير في العدوان الإسرائيلي المتواصل على لبنان الشقيق منذ ما يقارب العام. وأرحب بمشاركة السيد وزير خارجية لبنان عبد الله أبو حبيب الموقر في هذه الجلسة. السيد الرئيس، لقد تعرض لبنان يومي الثلاثاء والأربعاء الماضيين إلى عدوان سبراني إسرائيلي استهدف آلاف المدنيين اللبنانيين في كافة أرجاء البلاد في توقيت واحد، وذلك من خلال تفجير آلاف أجهزة البيجر والأجهزة اللاسلكية، مما أسفر عن استشهاد 37 شخصاً وإصابة 3250 غيرهم، لا يزال المئات منهم في حالة حرجة. بارتكابه لهذه الجريمة النكراء صعد كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من إرهابه بحق المدنيين اللبنانيين عبر استهدافهم وأسرهم داخل منازلهم وفي الأماكن العامة التي يرتادونها دون أي اعتبار لمبادئ القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني حقوق الإنسان والحد الأدنى للقيم الإنسانية والحضارية. السيد الرئيس، إن همجية كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ليست بجديدة، فقد قام منذ نشأته على القتل والإرهاب وارتكاب المجازر والفظائع، إلا أن الجديد هو ما اتسم به العدوان الأخير من توظيف للتقنيات الحديثة المدنية التي وجدت لخدمة البشرية وخيرها ورفاهها واستخدامها للقتل الجماعي للمدنيين. لقد حول كيان الاحتلال أجهزة عادية تستخدم لأغراض مدنية في مختلف القطاعات إلى قنابل موقوتة تقتل حامليها دون تمييز وتلحق بهم وبالمحيطين بهم إصابات بليغة، وأوجد حالة من انعدام الثقة حول العالم بمدى موثوقية وأمان أجهزة الاتصال بأشكالها كافة. لقد استخدمت سلطات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي على مدى الأشهر الماضية الهجمات السبرانية للتشويش على حركة النقل الجوي وتهديد أمن الطيران المدني الدولي وسلامة المسافرين في الأجواء اللبنانية وتعطيل الأنظمة التشغيلية المدنية وقرصنة شبكات الاتصالات والأجهزة الإلكترونية في المنشآت والمرافق الحيوية، وهي جرائم تؤكد جميعها استهتار إسرائيل بأرواح المدنيين وازدرائها للقانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني ومواثيق حقوق الإنسان. تدين المجموعة العربية بأشد العبارات العدوان الإرهابي الإسرائيلي على الشعب اللبناني الشقيق وتدعو لمساءلة مرتكبيه، وتعرب عن تعازيها الخالصة للبنان حكومة وشعبا ولأسر الضحايا وتمنياتها بالشفاء العاجل للجرحى. كما تعرب المجموعة العربية عن تضامنها الكامل مع لبنان ودعمه في مقاومته وتصديه للعدوان الإسرائيلي المتواصل الذي يهدد أمنه واستقراره ويلقي بأعباء إضافية على لبنان في الوقت الذي يواجه فيه تحديات كبيرة في قطاعات مختلفة بما فيها القطاع الصحي. تطالب المجموعة العربية مجلس الأمن بإدانة هذا الإرهاب السبراني الإسرائيلي والعدوان المتواصل على لبنان الشقيق، والذي يمثل امتدادا لأعمال الإبادة الجماعية والتطهير العرقي والانتهاكات الممنهجة للقانون الدولي التي يرتكبها كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بحق الشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق في قطاع غزة والضفة الغربية، واعتداءاته المتكررة على دول المنطقة بما فيها بلاد سوريا. وتؤكد المجموعة العربية أن الأعمال العدوانية الإسرائيلية لن تفلح بأي حال في سن الشعوب العربية عن التمسك بحقوقها المشروعة والمكفولة بموجب القانون الدولي وتحرير أراضيها المحتلة. كما تطالب المجموعة العربية مجلس الأمن بتحمل مسؤولياته في حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين ووقف العدوان بشكل فوري، ووضع قراراته ذات الصلة موضع التطبيق لإنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأراضي العربية في فلسطين وسوريا ولبنان، وتحمل كيان الاحتلال الإسرائيلي المسؤولية الكاملة عن أي تصعيد إضافي للأوضاع في المنطقة يهدد بجرها إلى حرب إقليمية. السيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي بالإدلاء بالملاحظات التالية بالصفة الوطنية. ينضم وفد بلاد سوريا لبيان المجموعة العربية، وتدين سوريا العدوان والإرهاب الإسرائيلي المتواصل على لبنان الشقيق، بما في ذلك الإرهاب السبراني الذي أدى لاستشهاد العشرات وإصابة آلاف غيرهم من بينهم السفير الإيراني في لبنان. كما تدين بلادي العدوان الهمجي الذي استهدف اليوم الضاحية الجنوبية السكنية في العاصمة اللبنانية بيروت، وأسفر عن استشهاد 14 شخصاً من بينهم عدد من الأطفال وإصابة 66 آخرين. تؤكد سوريا تضامنها القوي مع الشعب اللبناني الشقيق ووقوفها إلى جانبه، وتدعو جميع دول العالم وشعوبها إلى إدانة العدوان الإسرائيلي على لبنان والتحرك لوقفه ومساءلة سلطات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي عن جرائمها. كما تحمل سوريا الدول الداعمة لإسرائيل وفي مقدمتها الولايات المتحدة المسؤولية عن إمعان كيان الاحتلال في أعماله العدوانية وجرائمه الوحشية، وكذلك عن منع مجلس الأمن من الاطلاع بمسؤولياته في حفظ السلم والأمن الدوليين والتصدي للتهديد الذي يمثله كيان الاحتلال لهما. سيد الرئيس، ختاما، هناك سبب جذري واحد لما تشهده المنطقة العربية من عدم استقرار، ألا وهو استمرار الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للأراضي العربية المحتلة في فلسطين والجولان السوري وجنوب لبنان. إن أطفال مجد الشمس الذين يحاول ممثل الاحتلال المتاجرة بدمائهم الطاهرة هم أطفال سوريون من أهالي الجولان العربي السوري المحتل، وهم يتطلعون وأهاليهم لإنهاء الاحتلال وانسحابه من الجولان ليعودوا إلى وطنهم سوريا. والحل في المنطقة لا يكون إلا بإنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ووضع حد لممارساته الإجرامية وانتهاكاته الممنهجة للقانون الدولي. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.
تفضل.
سعادة الوزير، الأحداث الأخيرة أثبتت أن الشعب اللبناني لما يأتي الموضوع يتعلق بإسرائيل يكون موحدا في مواجهة هذا الكيان المجرم. ماذا تقول لهذا؟
الشعب اللبناني موحد بأي اعتداء على لبنان من أيا كان. فاليوم نحن موحدين من أجل لبنان ووحدة لبنان ووحدة أراضي لبنان.
شو الرسائل اللي عم توصل لكم اليوم بعد ضرب السابقة؟
بعد بكير نحكي عنها من الرسائل، بس شفتوا إذا كنتوا بمجلس الأمن شفتوا التأييد الكبير للبنان والدعم القوي اللي اجانا اليوم، يعني من معظم اللي تكلموا بمجلس الأمن، أعضاء مجلس الأمن بقصد.
بس هل هذا عم يترجم
بتعرف أكثر مني إنه هون مش ضرورة ما في أكثرية، في فيتو، في كذا، بتعرف هالاشياء هي بده هلا عم يشتغلوا، ونحن نتامل اللي حكيته بكلمتي انا انه يكون في ايدينا للعمل، لان هذا خطر مش على لبنان فقط بالمستقبل، هذا خطر على كل العالم اللي صار بلبنان.
سعادة الوزير ياسر نور الدين، قناة القاهرة الإخبارية، كلمة قوية من حضرتك النهارده أمام مجلس الأمن، لكن كيف ترى الدعم العربي خصوصا في ظل الهجمات الوحشية التي بدأت في غزة مرورا برفح ثم الآن في لبنان؟
حنبلش من مصر، نحن نشكر مصر رئيسا وشعبا لتأييده للبنان، وهي بفرجينا اياها دائما وزير الخارجية، ونحن مشكورين كثير لمصر. اوكي.
Minister, you said you want the Security Council to condemn this attack. Do you think they would condemn it?
I don't know. I have to wait for the result. I think they should condemn it, and I don't know. I really can't.
Minister, this is Stefan Vacara, Ital Press, La Voce in New York. The Israeli ambassador said that Israel doesn't want a war with Lebanon, but it's to you to stop Hezbollah. What is your answer to that?
Well, since you are here in New York, you've read at the beginning of the war the New York Times that was talking about a pre-attack on Lebanon, and then they changed their minds. I mean, that was there. They never denied it, the Israelis. They're always preparing for a war. And let me say this, whenever there is occupation, there is resistance. This is an international law, international understanding. Occupation means there is a resistance. And the Israelis say that they implement 1701 where? Every day there is a violation, especially in the air, every day since 2006. And their occupation of Lebanese territories, the 1701 says we should deal with it, they stop dealing with it. They are not dealing with it. They don't want to talk about it. So I don't know how they are really implementing 1701. And they accuse Lebanon of not implementing 1701. No, they are not implementing 1701.
الإسرائيلي ذراع الإسرائيلي كانت ضعيفة وكلمتك كانت قوية، والكل أعتقد أنه من سمع كلمتك يعني اقتنع بأن لبنان تعرض إلى هجوم إرهابي. برأيك لماذا مجلس الأمن لم يصدر على الأقل بيانا بإدانة؟
هناك اجتماع على مجلس الأمن، أعضاء مجلس الأمن فقط، فخلينا ننتظر النتيجة.
معاليك، هل تعتقد أن الحرب الشاملة بين لبنان وإسرائيل حتمي صايرة رح تصير؟
نحن نتمنى أن لا تكون حتميا، لأنه نحن منا طلاب حرب كحكومة وشعب، منا طلاب، ما بدنا حرب نحن، فإن شاء الله ما يكون في حرب.
تجربة إسرائيل في لبنان تجربة كما قلت حصيلة خيبات وهزائم، فهل تتوقع أن تعود إسرائيل هذه المرة أيضا بخيبة وبهزيمة أكبر؟
بدي أكرر اللي قلته كمان جوا، إنه إسرائيل لن تستطيع، أو بحكيها بالإنجليزي، Israel would not be able to return the displaced Israelis as long as there is war. And Israel would never have a war to win. Israel is not going to win the war. The war will continue no matter how many people die and no matter how many land is really wiped out by white phosphorus.
Can I have a follow-up on what you just answered?
Of course.
But do you want to prevent this war? And do you believe when Israel said it doesn't want now, maybe you said before, but now doesn't want war with Lebanon? What you are going to do to prevent this war?
The Americans, Mr. Hochstein went to Israel. He was supposed, if he was successful, to come to Lebanon. He didn't. He came back. Mr. Hochstein is the presidential envoy for peace between Lebanon and Israel. We are ready to talk with him anytime. If the Israelis have something to give, we will really negotiate, right? To achieve peace on the borders, you need negotiations. We're ready. He didn't come.
So how effective is the United States in this?
Effective?
Yes.
I think the United States is the only country, it's the only country, the main country that can contribute to security in the region.
What about the UAE?
So what about?
What about the UAE? Can they play a role?
UAE is not a member in the Security Council now, so.
What could the US do to de-escalate the situation that it is not doing now? What more would you like to see from the US?
They tried in the past. Mr. Hochstein goes and comes to Israel and Lebanon. We haven't seen him for some time, and in Lebanon. And I think the United States, shall we say, until now, did not succeed. But if any country is going to succeed, it will be the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
But Minister, what is it that the US could actually do?
More than that. expect anybody? No, the council is still in consultation, but it's closed. Right. Okay. But the ambassador is still there.
Okay. Because you know, like a lot of times they sneak out the back way.
Yeah,
You never know. So
I'm going to go and find that. Just wanted to know if you, nobody told you to leave, right?
yeah, usually someone from Malo comes to give you accreditation, so that's what I'm waiting for. All right, how are you?